Welcome back, everybody. So today I wanted to offer you a different type of video. This video is going to basically just cover all of the mysterious Japanese heavy tanks over the many years. And if you've searched around the subject before, you've probably heard of many weird Japanese heavy tanks. And you probably also know that the topic isn't well known about. Every tank has its questions, and a lot of people don't even think any of them exist. And maybe to some degree, none of them did actually exist. However, there is a large amount of eyewitness reports and documents that had shown up after the war that all seem to align to talk about the same few tanks. Tanks that happen to not fit any of the descriptions of the well-known Japanese medium or light tanks. But before we start talking about the Japanese heavy tanks, we have to talk about how they started to get developed. And it kind of actually starts with Japan's first indigenous tank design, which went by a few names. One I have set on was the Type 87 Chi-E, but also referred to as Experimental 1, which you might actually consider a heavy tank because of its massive size and large amount of guns compared to other tanks of its time. You see, this vehicle was built in the 30s, the early 30s to be more exact, and was comparable to tanks of Russia or Germany or the UK of the time. This tank had a 57mm tank gun, presumably the prototype version of the Type 90 57mm tank gun, and had a secondary turret on the front with a 6.5mm turret, as well as a butt turret with the same 6.5 machine gun. Its armor was 17mm of mild steel and had a 140 horsepower engine that could propel the 20-ton vehicle at 20 kilometers an hour. The desired speed was actually 25 kilometers an hour, and so obviously this design did not fit those specifications, but it showed that Japan could produce its own tank. Eventually, this design did turn into the Type 87 I-Go, which is a well-documented tank that saw combat throughout multiple wars, including the Second World War. But that wasn't the end of the Chi-E, or Experimental 1, as it received an upgrade. I believe the proper name of the upgraded version is Shisen Nigo Sensha Kai, but it could also be referred to as the Experimental Tank 1 Kai, which kept the same turret layout and arguably the same turrets, but also received a 150 horsepower engine that could propel the now 16-ton tank to 21 to 22 kilometers an hour. A nice upgrade, but it had a reduction to the amount of armor. It had now only 15mm opposed to the 17. However, it was still technically an upgrade because this 15mm was proper bulletproof armor, not just mild steel. Lastly, it had an upgrade to its main cannon from the Type 90 57mm tank gun to the Type 94 70mm tank gun. Well, it's assumed to be the Type 94, as Japan didn't have any other 70mm tank guns. And as the name of the Type 94 tank gun would imply, this thing was probably upgraded in 1934. A year later, the Type 91 tank, often referred to as the Experimental 2, was created. It was a general improvement to the design. It still had the same turret layout. The main gun originally was the same 57mm cannon that we saw on the Experimental 1, but that one was also later upgraded to the 70mm. Most notable upgrade was the armor now being up to 17mm thick. The final iteration of this design was the Type 95 Rogo, armed with the 70mm Type 94 cannon as well as a 37mm Type 94 cannon on a front turret. It still retained the butt MG turret though. The armor and the front was 35mm with 30mm side armor. About only 4 of them were made, and around this time people were kind of realizing that multi-turreted tanks only really served as propaganda posters. And to most people, that's when the story of Japanese heavy tanks take a pause, up until the development of the OI, the Japanese super heavy tank with a single 150mm gun and two 47mm turreted guns. But if you give this some thought, that doesn't make any sense. Not only does the Rogo and the OI look nothing alike, but if they were to build something so big as the OI, which is a massive tank, we'll get into the details of it in a bit, you'd expect them to have some experience with smaller tanks. Even if you say that the OI was never built, even to draw up the blueprints for it, you would have to know how a tank this size would function. And you couldn't use one of your existing Ha-Gos as an example. That there also, the Ha-Go and this tank look nothing alike, or the Chi-Ha or any other Japanese tank. To me, in a personal sense, I feel like there was many things in between the OI and the Rogo. And that's mainly what this video is going to be about, because it's not entirely an empty page. There has been some vehicles, perhaps maybe not found, but talked about, hinted towards, and written about. In fact, enough information has been gathered on these vehicles vehicles to publish a book. Well, there's only a section of the book that retains Japanese vehicles. The rest of it is about British vehicles. It is Forgotten Tanks and Guns of the 20s, 30s, and 40s by David Lister. Mr. Lister took a trip to the MI-10 archives. MI-10, or Military Intelligence Section 10, was the Department of British Doctrine of Military Intelligence, part of the War Office, and a forerunner to the modern GCHQ, or Government Communication Headquarters. Back during the war and after it, MI-10 had gathered information on a large number of Japanese tanks that a lot of people seem to have looked over in the past 70 so years. This information ranges from detailed drawings and descriptions of the tanks to eyewitness accounts. So starting off, we have something that is called the Type 97 heavy tank, often referred to as the Mitsu 97. This is actually the first of many Type 97 heavy tanks. We'll get into the other ones later. This one actually had some detailed descriptions and drawings of what you could anticipate it to look like. In the book that I'm referencing, they had a nice artistic interpretation of these drawings. The tank itself was 7.45 meters long, 3 meters wide, and 2.75 meters tall. It weighed 35 tons, or 32 metric tons, and had armor going from 22 to 35 millimeters. The strange part comes with the armament. It was armed with two 37mm cannons in the main turret. In the hull, it had two sub-turrets with MGs in it, and an additional MG on the back of the turret. It was powered by a 250 horsepower water-cooled Mitsubishi 12-cylinder engine that could propel the tank up to 28 miles per hour, or 45 kilometers per hour, and had a crew of 6. To many, this tank would seem almost fictional and thought of as just a drawing that a designer came up with after a Command and Conquer influenced fever dream. But the reports of this vehicle don't end at a description of itself. It also is reported to have been put into service on the 9th of November in 1936. But that's not all. There's a quite well-known Swedish tank identification chart that has a number of Japanese tanks, one of which is a British Vickers tank that apparently the Japanese had bought. But at the bottom of the page is a tank titled M37, stated to be 35 tons, armed with two 57mm cannons, as well as two MGs, and was armed with 15 to 63 millimeters. It had a 6-man crew and its max speed was 45 kilometers per hour. Quite a lot of those details happen to line up with the British report of the Mitsu 97. However, this one states a whole lot more armor, though I might just be reading the numbers wrong, and it states two 57mm guns opposed to 37s. Now, it would make you think, why exactly would the Swedish be informing anyone really of a tank design that Japan only ever drew up and never did anything with? This report here, as well as the British one, would make you think perhaps Japan actually did construct a Mitsu 97, and it was thought to be a threat to anyone doing anything that Japan might oppose. Now, I can't really back up the Swedish report because that's just a random image that has been shared around a million times on the internet. I don't know when it was created, by whom, for what purpose, and I don't know how much it was influenced by the British reports. However, the British reports themselves are stated in the book to be from MI-10, and those alone make it sound much like this tank was actually constructed. Now, if we continue on to the next tank, would be the I-96. This tank was 9.35 meters long, 3.24 meters wide, and 2.93 meters tall. It weighed 40 tons, or 36 metric tons, and had 25 to 35 millimeters of armor. It was also armed with two cannons, caliber not stated, but it's likely to be 37s, and also had two hull-mounted MGs, as well as another one in the back of the main turret. The engine was a 350 horsepower air and water-cooled Aichi V12 engine that could propel the tank up to 36 miles per hour or 56 kilometers an hour and had a crew of 10. This one also had a in-service date of February 1st, 1937, but also for this tank the story does not end there. A Japanese postcard from the era shows the silhouette of multiple tanks driving in a column. To my eyes it looks like a painting, though it's perhaps possible just a very low quality or perhaps artistically purposefully low quality image. However, the tanks being driven don't look like any well-recognized Japanese tanks. If you compare them to the most common Japanese tank of the era, the Type 97 Chi-Ha, you'll note that their size is massive, way bigger than what a Chi-Ha should be. It is suspected that these tanks are supposed to be the I-96. However, it is still possible that perhaps it was just an artist getting a little out of hand, but you have to think something at least would have inspired him to draw something so massive. The next tank is the Mitsu 104, another Mitsubishi heavy tank, this one being 8.3 meters long, 3.2 meters meters wide and 2.8 meters tall. It weighed a total of 32 tons or 29 metric tons. It had 25 to 30 millimeters of armor and was armed with a 75 millimeter cannon as well as 2 MGs in the back of the turrets. It also had 2 sub-turrets that could either have 2 MGs or 2 37s. It was powered by a 250 horsepower water-cooled Mitsubishi 12-cylinder engine that propelled the tank at 28 miles per hour or 45 kilometers per hour and had a crew of 8. This is another tank that has some other reports surrounding it. Primarily is a American tank identification sheet that strangely enough includes a tank that looks a whole lot like this one. However, on the chart it is called a Japanese heavy medium M104. This identification chart is also another one of those images that floats around the internet a whole lot. I probably could go track down the original source and talk about how accurate it is. However, I feel for me to go and do that would take an incredible amount of time, mainly because unfortunately the only version I have is too low of a resolution for me to read the fine print at the bottom. What I could say about this chart is that I feel like it had been created in the early 30s because of the tanks that it shows. Even if in the situation it was created to entertain civilians, they probably would have had sold more or whatever they use these for if they had included some of the late war tanks. In the scenario in which these were used as recruitment propaganda early on in 42, it'd be bizarre to include the concepts of a early heavy medium tank that apparently never left the drawing board, especially when all the other tanks on the identification sheet were real and saw combat. Next on the list, and a last tank from this book that we have some detailed information about, is the Ishii 108, which was first reported about in 1941 and is essentially a enlarged copy of the A1E1 Independent British land ship style tank. The original version of this tank was 7.59 meters long, 2.67 meters wide, and 2.72 meters tall, and only weighed 33 tons or 29, basically 30 metric tons. The Japanese copy of the tank was 9.75 meters long, 3.5 meters wide, and 2.8 meters tall, and weighed a total of 42 tons or 38 metric tons. Said to have 20 to 30 millimeters of armor, which is a bit more of and a bit less of the 28 millimeters of armor that the original had. The Japanese one was also armed with either a 70 millimeter cannon or 3 37 millimeter guns. Like the British one, it also had 4 sub-turrets, but they had MGs, and the 4th one had a flamethrower. I think the 37s could also go in the sub-turrets, but the book got a little confusing with the armaments, as it stated that in the paragraphs it had a 70 millimeter cannon, but in the little stat card it said 75 millimeter gun. Could just be an editor's mistake. Most tank cannons are 75 millimeters. Japan's odd with their 70 millimeter ones. Could also be a translation issue. Apparently these were originally made in French, at least some of them, and then it's now translated to English, so God knows what has been lost. The tank was powered by a 350 horsepower water-cooled 12-cylinder engine that could propel the tank up to 30 miles per hour or 48 kilometers an hour, and had a crew of 12. Now for images of this vehicle, unfortunately the book only produces an image of the turret, which looks just like the A1E1's turret, however it's missing the little mushroom cap. On the web there are other images supposedly of this tank, however I question the authenticity of these because they are the spitting image of the A1E1, the regular British one, and the Japanese version is supposed to be bigger. It just seems suspicious to me, but I'll let you make your mind about it. Now if it was an exact copy, that actually wouldn't be too surprising, because in the early 30s the tank was the victim of political espionage, with the plans ending up in the Soviet Union, and a British military officer was actually court-martialed in 1933 and served 5 years for providing the plans of the Independent as well as other British secrets to a German contact. So it wouldn't be too completely surprising if the Japanese literally just made this thing but bigger because they could, because they had the exact plans on how to make it. They seem to be floating around all over. So perhaps the Germans handed over the documents on how to create this thing to the Japanese, help improve relations either during the Second World War or years leading up to it. At the time, actually during most of the war, Japanese tank development was far behind everyone else, kind of being frozen in the mid-30s. And I'm sure the Germans had no use for the A1E1 Independent in the late 30s to early 40s. So I'm sure they would be totally willing to send that off. Now let's get back to the other reports of Type 97 heavy tanks. The first one, not actually reported as a heavy tank, but the description makes it sound kind of heavy. This was a report by a captured lieutenant of the 1st Independent Mixed Regiment on Saipan, who got captured in July of 44. He had said that his unit had trained on the Chiha in August of 41. He said that it had 15 millimeters of armor, which is about 20 less than usual. He said that it had 2 47 millimeter guns, one in the turret and one in the hull. There was a Type type of Chiha that had a hull-mounted cannon. It was referred to as the Komando Tanku Shiki, or Shiki for short. It was intended to be a commander tank, however, only really ever saw use as a trainer tank. And that one, its cannon was a 37 out of 47, and it only had one in the hull. There was no turret-mounted gun. This captured lieutenant also did say that the Chiha had a 12-cylinder diesel engine, which is true for Chihas. As for the size of this supposed Type 97, he said it could carry 30 ammo boxes that were 2 feet long, 1 feet tall, and 1.5 feet wide. A meter is a little bit shorter than a yard, so a foot is about a third of a meter. In whatever way these ammo boxes are aligned, the tank would have to be rather big to be able to carry 30 of them. What was also about this vehicle is the wheel configuration. While he said it had one drive wheel in the front, it had 2 smaller drive wheels in the back, about 14 inches across, which had made some assume that it was a very early on chassis design. And he also said that this particular tank could carry 3 crew members, while light tanks could carry 2, did not specify for heavy tanks, which is odd because the normal Type 97 Chiha can carry 4 crew members, a gunner, commander, a machine gunner, and a driver. And I don't see how a bigger tank could carry less crew members, unless he had some sort of strange epiphany of a modern MBT with an autolitter. On the web, I can find images supposedly of what this guy drew. The drawing itself is very poorly done, but the dude was a soldier, not an artist, so I'm not going to talk too negatively about that aspect. However, I can't stay for the authenticity of this image. It is not in my book, though it seems quite accurate. Not sure why somebody forging documents would draw the tank so poorly. There was another report of a tank called a Type 97, this one actually called a heavy tank, and it was by a POW who had been wounded on the island of Manus and had hoped that the natives of the island would hide him away from the invading Allied forces. Because the Japanese were quite horrible to the nations they conquered, of course the natives turned him in. Maybe next time you're conquering lands, you could think about the people that you're ruling over and how you're treating them. Maybe when the table turns, they could actually be on your side. Anyway, he had said he was a foreman at the Hitachi forging plant at Kamiria and saw many heavy tanks while working there. According to him, the Type 97 heavy tank was 22 feet long, or 6.7 meters, 9 feet wide, or 2.7 meters, and 8.5 feet tall, or 2.6 meters. Had weighed 27 tons, or 24 metric tons, and had 30 millimeters of armor. It was powered by a 300 horsepower engine that was able to drive the tank 15 miles per hour, or 24 kilometers an hour, and had a crew of 6. This POW also drew an image of the supposed tank that he saw, and unfortunately, it doesn't match the description of any of the tanks we have talked about prior in this video. For both of these POW story tanks, I personally don't have much faith that they're real. When you are captured by the enemy force, there's not a whole lot of reason for you to tell the truth, and you might want to make your equipment sound more impressive than it actually is in hopes to scare the enemy. Saying that it has 2 cannons instead of 1 could be a very simplistic way in which a soldier from the 40s might think to have their tank be more impressive. There's a few other tanks that had slight reports on them, but we don't even have an image to go off of at all. It's just a simple report. For example, the Showa 10 was reported back in 1934, only said to have 2 cannons and several MGs, which unfortunately details a number of these heavy tanks. And what I decided to call the last heavy tank, because it was reported about so late in the war. In 44, it was said that Japan had developed a 54-ton tank with a 4-inch gun. At the time, Japan did indeed create a 105mm tank gun that was intended for the Ho-Ri tank destroyer, which is a bit of a mystery. There were about 3 different variants, and no one's exactly sure what one's built, but people are pretty confident at least one of them was built. Supposedly, they are tossed in the lakes after the war and still yet to be found. The only source I can find information on how much these tanks weighed was saying it weighed 65 tons, so 54 tons would be much lighter. Now, of all of these heavy tanks that we just talked about so far, except for the early prototypes, it's suspected that some of them may have been sent to China, as there's been documents found saying that a logistics officer in China had requested 70mm tank ammunition. The only tanks with 70mm cannons at the time that are known about are the experimental ones and the Rogos, which are known to have stayed in Japan. My theory is that just about all these tanks were sent to China and served their time. However, when the war ended, Japan was ordered to have all of its troops come back. And doing so, they left a large amount of military supplies behind, lots of which were used in the Chinese Civil War. These supplies included all of these heavy tanks that have been forgotten from history and were probably melted down. At the time, China was still still quite a rough spot, going through a civil war. Soon after would be them partaking in the Korean War, and then after that would be the Great Leap Forward. On top of all of that, China is not an easy place to get information out of. There are many native Chinese vehicles that not everything is known about, let alone mysterious Japanese heavy tanks. The next tank to talk about is a tank that you can't make a Japanese heavy tank tree without mentioning, the well-known OI. For this entry and the section after it, I'm going to be using a bit of a controversial source, Seon Eun-Ae, or as many people know her as my Wolfentrager, as unfortunately Mr. Lister's book does not speak anything of the OI outside of a few mentions. For a long while, the OI was kind of just a mysterious tank whispered about and had a few rumors float around. Although the modeling company Fine Molds had went out and I guess settled these rumors once and for all and found who had a number of documents on the OI and bought them so they could make an accurate representation of what the tank actually looked like. I believe this information was published into a book. Unfortunately, that book is not only in Japanese, but also expensive. I neither have money or know Japanese, so that is a bit out of my reach. Luckily for me, however, Miss Sun has made a actually pretty recent post on her blog talking about it and a few other fake tanks that we will discuss in a bit. The OI is not a simple vehicle like the other ones we've talked about. There is a lot of information known about it. You can make a whole video talking about it and its history. In fact, you could probably write a book on it. A general rundown of its history is in 1939, after the Battle of Kölkin Gol, Japan had noticed that its tank designs and doctrine were outdated compared to the rest of the world. It didn't take this enough to heart the point where they started a rapid improvement of its vehicles. Instead, they had decided that they needed a certain special tank for this environment. Colonel Hideo Iwakuro interpreted this as to build a massive super tank, a mobile bunker type of thing. The design started being drawn up in 1940 under the name Mito, a mix between the company building it, Mitsubishi, and the city it was being built in, Tokyo. The design of this tank was, to be frank, almost comedic, the size it was. 3 turrets, it had a length of 10.1 meters, a width of 4.8 meters, and a height of 3.6 meters. The main cannon was to be a 105mm Type 96 howitzer, and sub-turrets it had 2 47mm Type 1 cannons, and in the back was a single turret with 2 MGs in it. The 150mm cannon could shoot APHE with a muzzle velocity of 450 meters per second, and apparently could penetrate 125mm at 230 meters, which would definitely be enough to deal with Russian tanks. Could of course also shoot HE, but apparently also heat rounds, shrapnel, smoke, and incendiary tracers, though I'm not completely certain or have any sources on the power of those shells. The initial prototype, and I'm pretty sure the vehicle that initially did get tested, only had a 75mm of front armor at a very nice angle, and the side armor was only 35mm. The planned version was to have a total of 150mm, so an increase of 75 more millimeters of frontal armor at extreme angles, as well as an additional 35mm side skirts, essentially. But also inside of the tank, there were 2 20mm walls dividing the tank into 3 sections. The tank was powered by 2 550 Kawasaki V12 engines that propelled the tank without the additional armor up to 40 kilometers an hour. But with the additional armor and full turret, it was projected to be only able to go 30 kilometers an hour. And the tank was controlled by 11 crewmates, 1 driver, 1 co-driver, 3 main turret gunners, 1 commander, 2 secondary turret gunners, and a rear turret gunner. This tank was constructed at the Sigami Army Arsenal, and secret, of course. Creation of the prototype had many moments where it stopped and then resumed, and it took all the way to May of 43 for the thing to be ready for trials. The trials themselves did not fare well. It had rained days prior that had softened the soil, and soft soil and a 150-ton tank. In fact, I think it was actually in the lighter configuration of only 96 tons. It didn't mix well. Eventually, the tank sank a meter under the ground and had to be towed out. During this incident, it had taken on a considerable amount of damage and could not continue the trials the next day. As you can imagine, in late war Japan, repairing the tank was incredibly expensive, and it stayed at the Sigami Arsenal until March of 45, not long after the war ended. Between those months, it doesn't seem exactly written down what happened to this vehicle. You would probably assume that it got scrapped. Personally, I like to believe that it's either left in some warehouse similar to the one in Indiana Jones, full of many other Japanese mysteries, or is sitting out in the jungle somewhere, waiting to be discovered, though scrapping is the most likelihood. There was one part that did survive. A single track link can be observed at the Wakajishi Shrine, because information on this tank was not well known up until the point when Fine Molds purchased and published published all the known documentation on it. When writing about Japanese tanks, people had to essentially fill in the blanks with assumptions of what they thought the vehicle would be like. One of these, for example, is the Iwakuru 100 ton, more commonly known as the Oni or Type 100 OI or OI 100 ton. This tank is said to have been tested in 1942, being an early prototype of the OI. However, there's a few issues with this, the main one being the design of the tank obviously resembles the Chi-Ri. However, the Chi-Ri was developed much later than war. That is why it's known as the Type 5 Chi-Ri, because it was created in the Imperial Japanese year 2605 or 1945. This 100-ton OI is also said to have a 105mm cannon, but in 1942, Japan didn't have any effective 105mm tank cannons. The next fake version of the OI would be the 120-ton version, also commonly known as the OHO or the Type 120 OI. This one was much different, and perhaps if the OI was adopted very early on, this could have been an eventual modification of the vehicle. It seems the assumption of this tank comes from two different situations. One was after 43, when the vehicle was still under repairs. One of the engineers had proposed some changes they could have made to it. However, these changes never happened. The other situation is the weight of the vehicle. Being constructed in a bit of a modular way, the initial chassis weighed 47 tons without any additional armor. When undergoing mobility and defensive tests, it was weighed at 97 tons, but this did not include the turrets. With the two 47mm cannon turrets and the machine gun turret in the back, it weighed 120 tons. And with the primary turret, as well as the additional 75mm plating, it weighed 150 tons, the final intended weight. The final two fake tanks are also quite well known, mainly because of the game World of Tanks. They are the Type 4 and Type 5 Super Heavies. The story starts with this image. Many of people suspect is fake for some reason. I can assure you it's quite real. You can find very old posts on accesshistory.com of people showing it. The actual photo is of two Russian soldiers after the fall of Koto Fortress in northern China. For whatever reason, possibly because it looks like it has a cupola, people had thought perhaps this is the turret of the fabled OI tank. However, it is more likely just a coastal defense turret, as Koto Fortress had a number of them, including ones that had what looked like cupolas on them. However, in 2013, Wargaming had released a number of images of apparently Soviet reports of what were massive Japanese super heavy tanks, weighing up to 200 tons. Supposedly, these reports were made by a Soviet engineer by the name of Grigoriev, who apparently did not have a last name, as I don't find that published anywhere. The reports themselves say that Japan had been developing, not in Japan, but in Manchuria, massive super heavy tanks that were powered by German engines and used light cruiser cannons, 140mm guns, as their primary armament. They had no sub-turrets, unlike every other Japanese heavy tank. It seems the main focus of these reports was a complicated cooling system, which there is a drawing of, as well as a few for the engine. According to the internet rumors about these vehicles, after taking the fortress and taking notes of the vehicles and little to no pictures of them, the Soviets decided to blow them up. They did blow up a number of bunkers at Koto Fortress, but there should be a number of red flags showing that these things were most likely completely fictional. Primarily, why did they blow it up? There are many German prototype tanks that the Russians captured, and sure, they used them as target practice for a while. The British did that too, but you can currently see these vehicles in museums. There was no point in which the Russians were like, yeah, let's just blow it up now. You could perhaps say that maybe they didn't realize it was a turret bunker and the turret belonged to this Japanese super heavy tank. However, how did Wargaming know that this image belonged to the tank if the Russian army who were there didn't recognize it? Even on that, you would have expect them to take more images of it, at least on the inside, if it had looked as if it was supposed to be for a tank. But also these reports say that they found a wood mock-up version of these vehicles, so why didn't they keep that at least, or take photos of it? It doesn't make sense. Another red flag is that there are no Japanese sources that talk about these vehicles. Now, Koto Fortress was quite a secretive place, but you'd at least assume you'd be able to find information about the vehicles from mainland Japan, especially if you can find things about their other secret projects like the actual OI. It's almost implying as if the forces in Manchuria were secretly developing their own super heavy tank that was more advanced than the heavy tanks on mainland Japan. Another question would be, how did they get a naval gun for a tank? It is quite well known that the Japanese Imperial Army and the Japanese Imperial Navy did not like each other very much, and sharing equipment did not happen much at all. The final red flag should be known that World of Tanks often makes up things. They are not at all in any way way a useful source for information of any sort beyond the game itself. Really, that should be said about all games, but from my observation, it seems that World of Tanks likes to pass on its information as if it is true, even though it clearly is not. The last fake tank is a fake tank in a more literal sense. Some people think it's a real tank or a certain known heavy tank, but this image right here is actually a mock-up of assumed European tanks of the time that was built, I believe, for a festival. Unfortunately, the only images taken of it were with the world's worst camera, so you can't really see the details, but apparently it's made out of wood. Now that there is all the published information I can find on Japanese heavy tanks, or things that you would consider a heavy tank that Japan used. However, I feel the subject is not complete. In fact, you could say that because a lot of the information we have is on tanks we don't know any information about. There are even some images of Japanese tanks, or what look to be Japanese tanks, that I don't have any information at all. For example, my research assistant, 1Max, fished up this image from apparently a Russian website that is now closed. The vehicle itself looks like some random medium tank, but if you notice, the exhaust system doesn't match up with many Japanese tanks, and the ones it does doesn't match up with the amount of wheels that it has in the tracks. On that also, if you look closely, it looks like there's a dude coming out of a driver's seat hatch, which would imply the tank to be rather big, and also that the turret is offset. But the only Japanese tank that I can spot that is big enough to have a driver's seat hatch is the Chi-Ri, and that tank's turret isn't offset. It also is too short to be a Chi-Ri. The largest offset turret tank I can find for Japan is the Chi-To, but the Chi-To is too small to have a driver's seat hatch. Another strange event is this medal, obviously modeled after some sort of Japanese light tank, or at least you would assume it to be a light tank, but the details of it don't line up perfectly with any Japanese light tank I could identify. You might think that it is just simplistic because metallurgy is kind of hard, but there are plenty of other medals made of Japanese tanks where they put quite a lot of detail into it, so why would they screw up on this one? And some other slight instances, like various propaganda works of tanks that don't really match up with any other Japanese tank. You could say it's just the artist getting a little creative, but that's inspired from somewhere. I'm sure there's plenty of others you can find. Hopefully my video here has inspired you to perhaps look into the subject yourself. There's a lot to be found out, plenty more that perhaps maybe you could actually be the first to learn. And hey, if you happen to live in Japan, maybe check your attic, look for any old photos of the war. Just maybe they'll find some mysterious tank that no one's ever seen in over 70 years. Now that's all I really have for this video, so I hope you enjoyed it a whole lot. It's a bit different than my usual content, and I think I'll relate it to the game War Thunder in a next video. Before I close it out, first I'd like to thank my patrons, YouTube members, and Twitch subs. Thank you very much, guys. I also want to give a special thanks to 1Max for helping me find information and images to use in this video. If you've enjoyed this video, be sure to hit the like button. If you primarily enjoyed this style of video, not necessarily talking about War Thunder, but just the tanks in general, be sure to comment down below. I do have some other ideas for interesting history videos. I have ideas for one about tanks in the Middle East and their history there, as well as US land ships in a more literal sense. Could also do one on the Chinese Navy. If you have any interest in anything like that, just be sure to tell me. Anyways, that's really all I have to say for this video, so you know what to do. Hit the subscribe button, hit the bell icon to be notified anytime I do anything, and hit me up on Discord if you have any interesting history ideas. Now thanks for watching, I hope you have a fantastic day. In the term of bonus news, Seon Eun-Ae, or my waffle tractor, is not dead. Why were people thinking she died or was going to die? Like, come on. I'm gonna blame that on Reddit, but don't just go around assuming someone's gonna die because they say they feel ill.